you can request something like that. However, I mean, practically speaking, we are aware at this time that schools are closed. Oh, and one component to point out, because I get this question a lot, the final piece of the child care documentation is a representation by the employee that a suitable alternative person is not available. That seems to be a frequent concern for employers, that employees are taking the time off with a spouse or with a partner who is also home and able to care for the child. Small business exemption. So this is what came to mind immediately during the initial discussion at the top of this meeting, that some employers were having some difficulty getting employees back. There actually is a small business exemption for businesses with fewer than 50 employees. You do have to have a business-based rationale. There are a few different appropriate business-based rationales set forth in the regulations. To summarize all of these rationales, what they come down to is that your business is having difficulty operating either without this particular individual or without the workforce as a whole. So they are based on either this particular individual has a particular skill set, is particularly valuable, or because of the number of employees you have as a whole, you are unable to sacrifice employees for FFCRA leaves. So we just need to make sure that the exemption is documented carefully to the file. You do not have to apply anywhere for the exemption. This has a significant precedent with the Department of Labor. There are other reasons, other laws under which the Department of Labor just requires you to document a decision to the file as opposed to specifically applying. So this is it's a typical practice for the Department of Labor. So you do not have to apply for the small business exemption. You just simply have to document to the file. I don't mean to imply, though, that this is just a simple documentation. This is the type of thing that you may want to retain legal counsel to make sure that if you are going to apply for that if you are going to take the exemption, that your rationale for the exemption is carefully documented in the case of an audit or a claim by an employee. So another way that risk management has kind of gone upside down after the COVID-19 workplace is medical assessments. Normally, your employment counsel will advise to avoid medical assessments pretty much all the time, except for prior to an offer of employment, and that you want to exercise extreme caution in sending employees home when they appear ill, because we do not want to single anyone out or give the appearance that we believe an employee is disabled or unable to perform the functions of their job. And we would typically advise you to require documented proof of a doctor's orders. So that's the normal risk management is to prioritize more the suspicion that employees may be abusing the system, so to speak. Or your policies. However, in the COVID-19 era, we prioritize more, and this is also coming from the Equal Opportunity Commission, EEOC's recent guidance. We prioritize more maintaining employee health in the workplace to prevent or to manage the spread of COVID-19. Temperature screening is encouraged, and sometimes it's even mandatory under the Department of Health's order when you have a probable or confirmed case of COVID-19 in the workplace. Employees who appear ill, now the more appropriate risk management response would be to send those employees home. And then finally, risk management principles now would encourage flexibility to the extent necessary with documentation. There's plenty of guidance out there to the extent that employees have been having some difficulty getting medical documentation in the way they normally would because of the overflow of medical facilities. So there are some ways in the area of medical assessments that risk management considerations have changed. The Department of Health issued an order that was effective quite a while ago, but I heard some of you at the opening talk about your businesses are now just beginning to be considered quote unquote essential under the governor's guidelines, and you are going to be opening now. So you may not have been too concerned with the Department of Health's order, but you may now be interested in those guidelines to bring your business into compliance. So the one thing to know for those of us, I mean, lawyers are not considered at this point part of the essential businesses. So there are many of you here who are also in that position. We may see a different order, different guidelines from the Department of Health after we all become ready to open. So when there are more businesses opening. But as of now, the Department of Health's order provides some protocols that businesses that are now opening need to follow for response to exposure. The Department of Health's order is very user-friendly, easy to read. Sometimes there are some areas of confusion that I'll bring out, but generally the Department of Health's orders pretty simple to read. One of those areas of confusion has been the temperature screening. I've had clients that were reopening concerned that they were going to have to be taking the temperature of every employee entering the building to be compliant. That is just simply not the case. Temperature screening is only required by the Department of Health if you have a probable or confirmed case. And even in that case, it's only required for the first 14 calendar days after your workplace has been infected by COVID-19. If you have, for some reason, a huge onslaught of infections or your workplace seems to have a spread breaking out in the workplace, the Department of Health's order encourages you then to implement daily temperature screening. However, in the normal course of business, we only need to have temperature screening if there isn't a probable or confirmed case. So the difference there is a probable case is when an employee is experiencing symptoms and based on the symptoms can be determined to probably have COVID-19, but they have not been tested. That's a probable case. A confirmed case, obviously, is when an employee has been tested and determined conclusively, at least to the highest extent that our tests can determine that conclusively, to have COVID-19. Daily PPE and social distancing are covered under the Department of Health's orders. The PPE that is required is the facial masking. Employers are required to provide that to the extent that you can. The Department of Health has specified in its guidelines subsequent to the order that this is really the employer's responsibility to monitor. So the Department of Health has indicated it's not as if someone's going to come to your office from the Department of Health, stand there and monitor that all your employees are wearing masks. This is something for the employer to monitor and control to the best of your ability in the workplace. Also, the Department of Health's order addresses social distancing, and there are really no surprises there. The order as of now, as stated, it could change, but as of now, the social distancing order is pretty much what we have been hearing from other sources of limiting the congregating of groups and the number of individuals who can enter a room at one time. All that information set forth in the Department of Health's order. A word on temperature screening, which seems to be the source of confusion for some employers. Temperature screening is only really required for the first 14 calendar days after exposure. I have employers who are doing regular wellness checks. That's just important for them in their workplace to manage risk. As I indicated a couple slides ago, that risk management is somewhat topsy-turvy. You wouldn't see employers doing wellness checks on employees regularly. They'd be too concerned about getting some health information on the employee that they may not want to have. But many employers have been performing regular wellness checks. For those wellness checks that the employer decides to do just to manage that particular employer's risk, you do not need to have a long line of employees standing out the door at the workplace to perform temperature screenings if you're just doing those screenings for wellness purposes. You can rely on home tests if that is more efficient for your organization. To the extent that you can rely on home tests, it does help manage employee confidentiality. To the extent that you don't have employees seeing others being singled out, if there would be an issue with the screening and employees are not as able to be aware of one another's health information as they would be if those screenings are actually done on the workplace. So the only time, just to be clear, the only time that really screenings should be done actually at the workplace is within those first 14 calendar days after a probable or confirmed case. Otherwise, if you're just following a wellness process, you may rely on at-home screenings if you would prefer. What to do about PTO for employees sent home? This is another frequently asked question. So the scenario is you as the employer walk up to employee John Smith. He is having trouble breathing. He is coughing. He has symptoms that clearly seem to indicate that there may be a case of COVID-19 present. You say to John Smith, you know, you really need to go home. The best advice in that case is to hold employees harmless, because you as the employer are telling the employee to go home. It's for the benefit of the employer that the employee is being sent home. It's not the employee calling off for the day. So the best advice there is to hold the employee completely harmless and pay whatever you would have paid for the employee to be at work, at least as to that day that you're sending them home to seek medical guidance as to their next steps. So that's not really, that's not a requirement. However, the FFCRA may apply in those cases if the employee is ultimately advised by a physician to self-quarantine, which in those cases they probably would be if you walk up to an employee and see those symptoms. In that case, the FFCRA does have caps and limitations on how much the employee can be paid. For those first 2 weeks, generally speaking, most of your employees will be eligible for the full salary unless they make enough to exceed the caps that apply. You may have employee policies or CBA provisions that apply. So just, I have that in yellow there. So just exercise caution. If you are a unionized workforce, I don't know if any of you are here today. I don't recognize anyone from a unionized workforce, but if you are, you would want to turn to the CBA. Most CBAs in that case would require the employer to pay the salary. And then finally, defaulting to the Fair Labor Standards Act pay requirements. If the employee who you send home is an exempt employee, they would need to be paid their full salary because they showed up to work, prepared to work. If the employee is an hourly wage earning employee, the Fair Labor Standards Act provides they only need to be paid for actual time worked. Still, best advice is to hold the employee harmless if you as the employer are sending them home.
This is Donna. How may I help you?
So a third way that risk management has been turned upside down is the employer control of the physical presence. Normally, and certainly still to this day, it's an employer prerogative to direct and control physical presence, but that's prioritized more under normal circumstances. In other words, under normal circumstances, the employer's ability to direct and control physical presence is a higher priority in most cases than the employee's individual circumstances, at least from a legal perspective. Certainly, different businesses have different corporate cultures and perspectives on that. In the COVID-19 era, when we're opening for business, we need to proceed somewhat with caution from a risk management perspective in directing the physical presence of employees. You will, if you haven't already, you will certainly have employees resist physical presence in the workplace. And in that case, I encourage you to divide those employees into 3 general classifications, which I will talk to you about in a moment. And in certain cases, you may have an employee who is what you would consider to be under your policies insubordinate. I would encourage you to, again, look at employees into these 3 general categories I'm going to discuss with you and proceed with caution before terminating an employee based on their resistance to return to work. So 3 general categories of resistant employees. First of all, is the category that you would want to exercise extreme caution before forcing their physical presence in the workplace or making their physical presence a condition of their continued employment. And these are employees who may be entitled to leave under FFCRA. Many employers say, well, shouldn't the employee come to me and ask me for leave? Yes, generally that's how it goes, but to be in the best position possible to manage your legal risk, it's a recommendation that you as the employer make employees aware of the availability of this leave and exercise extreme caution before trying to compel an employee into work who could be legally entitled to leave under federal law. We would want to make sure, as your advocates, that you have absolutely done your due diligence before requiring the physical presence of someone who could be entitled to leave. And on prior slides, we did address the FFCRA. If you have any questions about that, I'll leave that up to you, because that can be a kind of a dry area for me to just kind of lecture you on, especially if you're not too interested in how that applies, or you're already pretty secure in your knowledge of how that applies. Second, a heightened degree of caution, not necessarily the red light, but the yellow light. So you want to exercise a degree of caution with resistant employees who might be part of a vulnerable population or somehow compromised. So these are the employees who, they haven't been necessarily advised by a physician that they need to quarantine. They don't have any type of need that would qualify under the FFCRA, but they might be an older employee, or they might be somehow compromised with their immunity to infection, and they're resistant to the workplace for these reasons. They may actually have legitimate fears of returning to work, as opposed to just worries from maybe, paying a little bit too much attention to the news or something like that. For this category of employees, you want to look at the cases on an individualized basis and determine whether for you want to kind of make a business decision, whether for you as the employer, it's going to be worth the risk of bringing someone like this into the workplace is going to exceed the output, their ability to perform and be a valuable member of your workforce in person. There are a couple considerations. First of all, we have just a general workers' compensation considerations I'm sure you're all aware of. If there is an infection that occurs in the workplace and an employee can establish occurred in the workplace, because we are currently still operating under a lot of travel restrictions, the employee would probably be in a better position to establish that an infection occurred in the workplace than they normally are, even though this is still a difficult standard to meet. So you certainly have workers' compensation considerations to think about, but also just in terms of the safety of your workplace in general and managing the potential of spread or outbreak in your workplace. So if you have someone who's part of a vulnerable population or has some other type of concern that isn't just excessive worrying, you may want to make an individualized decision as to that employee that it's worth more for you to keep them out of the workplace because their risk to the workplace outweighs what they would be able to do for you as an employee in the workplace. Or you may make the opposite decision, either way, but it's that second category is kind of up to you based on weighing the relevant risks and potential what you could get out of that employee as an asset to your company. And then finally, number 3, would be just cautiously following your normal policies. This is when you have an employee who's resistant to return to the workplace. However, they don't really have a legally entitled reason for leave under the FFCRA, at least any that are known to you as the employer. They don't really present as part of a vulnerable population. They don't seem to have fears that you as the employer would consider legitimate. However, even with this particular population, it is advisable to make an individualized determination and to speak with the person and see what the rationale is. If you as the employer determine that there really isn't any risk management reason to keep them out, there is no legal entitlement for them to be out, then these employees, if you're open for business, they need to come into business. Some of these employees, and I actually have, believe it or not, many of you probably would believe it, I have seen quite a few cases of employees citing unemployment compensation as a rationale for not coming into work. And I mean blatantly. where the employee calls up the employer, or the employer calls up the employee and says, guess what, we qualified for the PPP loan, or, just that we're opening for business, and you have a job again. We're calling you back into work. I have heard of multiple cases of that employee saying, no, I'm not coming in. I'm actually doing better on unemployment compensation than I was working for your business. So those employees clearly fall into category number 3, no need to proceed with caution. In fact, I'm going to be talking to you later on about how to manage what could be fraud. And you as the employer do not want to participate in unemployment compensation fraud. So more to come on that. Legal tips for re-entering the workplace at this time, and I have this straight from the source at OSHA. We have contacts there that OSHA does not currently have a particular guideline or regulation for COVID-19 in the workplace. So these tips are all for just practical risk management tips on re-entering the workplace. First of all, you want to develop and implement a social distancing or re-entry plan. This plan should be something that is consistent with your corporate culture so that you're able to enforce it. One of the advantages of not having an OSHA regulation that really applies to COVID-19 is that you can create something that works within the Department of Health's order and the guidelines, the federal guidelines that actually can be practically enforced in your workplace. So you want to develop and implement an individualized policy that you are able to enforce consistently on a daily basis in your workplace. And you will also want to then have employees sign an acknowledgement, really, because under the Pennsylvania workers' compensation law, we can't have employees waive all liability. So we can't make employees sign something that actually could be enforceable that says that employer will not be liable for any illness or injury in the workplace. That's just not possible. It just wouldn't be possible to enforce that in the way that you as the employer would be looking to enforce that. But what we can do is have them sign an acknowledgement as a measure of risk management that they have read and understood the reentry policy and provide a reporting structure for if the employee observes a coworker not following the social distancing policy. So for example, the acknowledgement might say that they have read and understood the social distancing policy and that they are to report to HR if they witness any violations of the social distancing policy. Also, you may want your acknowledgement to say something to the effect that it is not possible for the employer to be everywhere in the workplace and to witness everything. So the employee needs to understand that we cannot guarantee that there would be no infection in the workplace, not to scare anybody, but just that is the reality that they have to understand in entering the workplace, is that we cannot guarantee that there would never be an infection. We can only do our best to manage the risk. Secondly, requiring PPE, especially where social distancing may be compromised. The Department of Health's order goes a bit beyond that and requiring PPE even when the employee may otherwise be socially distant. So just so you're aware, that's what the order says. But particularly where, for practical purposes, particularly where social distancing is compromised and you have employees in working more closely with each other, certainly we need to require facial masks and other PPE. I have not seen any guidance that has required gloves for normal workplaces. Certainly in health situations, it could be different. It's just basically the facial masking that's been encouraged. Finally, encouraging and supporting enhanced workplace hygiene. This is an area where many members of the HR and the employment law community have seen something that we think could be a possible improvement in the workplace following COVID-19, is that we will see, hopefully, an improvement in workplace hygiene that will help support your workplace in managing employee absenteeism in the first place. So this could be actually a positive change, and it's something that you can start enforcing now or start encouraging now as a measure to manage the risk and the spread of COVID-19 in the workplace. Provide clear notices of expectations throughout the workplace, and this would be so that your clients, customers, and employees are aware of your expectations to manage the spread of COVID-19 in the workplace. And then finally, I don't have that you should do daily wellness checks here as a tip. I just have that maybe you should consider it. All of your workplaces are different. I'm sure if we went around the room and if I were there in person, I probably would go table to table and talk to you about what your workplace is like, and whether daily wellness checks is something that you would want to consider individually. But just as a measure of risk management, just consider whether for your workplace daily wellness checks could be useful. Daily wellness checks being employees monitoring their own temperatures, reporting daily as to whether they're experiencing symptoms, and just other measures of making sure that your employees are well before they enter the building. And in some cases, some businesses have been also doing daily wellness checks of customers or clients. I don't know if that's the most advisable thing, but it is something that is being done out there in the workplace. So bonus tip, employee recall. I'm not going to stay on this too long because I want to open it up to your questions, but how do you recall employees in a time of unemployment compensation premium pay? Many of you have employees who are actually making more on unemployment compensation, and then it wasn't too long ago that the governor announced that if you call an employee back to work and they say, oh, I'm making more on unemployment compensation, well, you as the employer should just start paying them more. That was the response from the governor. That is not the response under the law at all. Okay, so the response under the law is quite different. And obviously you can pay anybody more who you want to, but that's not required at all. If you have employees who are refusing suitable work, and I mean you as the employer know that you're following the appropriate guidelines of social distancing, and you know that you are opening appropriately as an essential business, that employee may be ineligible for unemployment compensation, and they actually could be committing fraud. You as the employer would just want to notify the Department of Labor within 7 calendar days of the employee's refusal. There is a specific form that the Department of Labor has created for this purpose. It's very simple to complete. I provided a link to a blog that I wrote on this topic that gives you all of the information that you need about the form to complete. It's very simple. I get the question a lot from employers of whether you only complete this form as to employees who are currently receiving unemployment compensation. You don't need to worry or do any investigation at all. You as the employer do not need to concern yourself with, are they receiving unemployment compensation? Are they not? You don't need to do any kind of investigation into the fraud. And in fact, please don't. What you would do if you call up an employee and say, we're open for business, come back to work, and they say no, and it's not for one of the, if you go back to my slide with the 3 categories, and it's not someone who fits within the first category, and there's no reason for them to be refusing the work, that employee may be committing unemployment compensation fraud, and you as the employer would want to notify the Department of Labor. Now, just a word of clarification on what I just said. Okay, so you call the employee, Jane Smith, back to work. Jane Smith says, well, I'm unable to secure childcare because my child's daycare was closed due to COVID-19. She still comes back. Jane Smith still comes back, and you recall her, but then you place her on the appropriate leave under the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. Her inability to secure child care is not a reason for her to continue to receive unemployment compensation. If she is eligible for recall to your workplace, you recall her, put her on leave for the period of time that she's entitled to leave under the FFCRA, and then this whole time, she is an employee. So there really should be no reason for somebody to refuse work and then continue to receive unemployment compensation. The only viable reason for that might be if your business is not following the Department of Health's order, or if you're opening before you're able to open under the governor's guidelines. So If you want to check out the blog, I have a link there. I would encourage you to check that out because I have not only the information on the form, but also I have 3 steps for you on recalling employees during a time of unemployment compensation premium pay. So please check that out if you get a chance. I would love to hear your questions. Thank you so much for having me here today, and thank you for your time and your attention. I know you're going through a lot right now as the business community, and I look forward to your questions.
Keely, I got to say, we've had a lot of speakers, and that was an impressive 42-minute run of information. Thank you for that. I kept waiting for you to take a breath or a drink, and you kept going. Thank you.
Oh, sure, you're welcome. Hey, that's an attorney. That's an attorney for you. We could talk all day.
We have had some questions come in through the chat while you were going. We want to make sure we get to those. One of them I sent to you. Let me go up a bit here. See what we got. First one. If an employee does not report to work and does not call out, are they protected under current legislation from termination or discipline? Or do we get, I guess that was a question from John Black. John, if you want to clarify it, now is the moment. If there's anything to add to the way I typed that up, I was trying to paraphrase it appropriately.
Okay, so basically we have an instance where an employee is basically ghosting us. Won't return phone calls, emails, or texts, won't report for work.
Okay. All right. That's a great question, John, and that actually is pretty common. So is this, and I'm not asking you for an employee name, but is this someone who was at one time furloughed and could be on unemployment compensation right now?
That is correct.
Okay, so for this person, what I would recommend that you do is send a formal letter to the individual telling them that they're being recalled to work and that they're being offered work. And at that point, and then I would give them a specific date to respond by. If they don't respond by that date, then we need to complete the paperwork for the Department of Labor to report that person that they have refused suitable work. That to me sounds like a circumstance. I mean, if we want to give that employee the benefit of a doubt, they're just going through a lot right now with COVID-19. All right, so we send them the letter, we give them some additional time to respond. That's us being understanding employer. And also documenting the offer of suitable work. However, once they've been given that notification to their last known address and they've been given time to respond and they don't, that could be very well be a circumstance of fraud.
Thank you.
All right, another question that come in from Donna. And Donna, I'll read the question. Feel free to clarify afterwards. As an employee under 50 who has gotten PPE, or PPP loan, I'm guessing, if we pay the employee 2/3 when they say they can stay out, are they still able to collect unemployment? And if I find unemployment in the additional 600, she finds employment in the additional 600 per week, encourages employees to stay out for childcare reasons, what is the max age of a child?
Yeah. Okay. So that's a good point. A child, unfortunately, is defined as 18. So that's not too helpful, and it's also not too realistic. But that being said, my guess is that it's defined that way because of the school closure. So in all likelihood, the rationale for an older child being someone who is now requiring at-home school is probably not the case anymore. So you probably, in other words, cannot have a circumstance where an employee says, my 13-year-old kid, their school closed, so now I am requiring to stay home. The school year is either ending or will end soon. So that really isn't, at-home education really isn't a reason anymore. So you said, Donna, I think you said that you have fewer than 50, right? Yes. Okay. So then you may qualify for the exemption. You were actually someone I thought of as I was going through my presentation. So is that something that you would be interested? Do you think that might solve your problem? No. Can you I think you might be muted, but can you explain the situation a little bit more?
I got you. You are unmuted, Donna.
Okay, so here's the issue. When they can collect unemployment plus get the extra $600, it is very lucrative for them to stay on unemployment. However, I'm looking at the ruling here on the CARES Act, and it says, from what I can see, the Family First Act, I can see we could pay them 2/3 of their salary, of their, hourly rate, whatever, because I do have the PPE. So
Right.
if I do that, she's going to be under what she could collect. And her child is 13. So yeah.
Now,
So
you
I'm saying, is it better for me to put her back on payroll, because then she won't be making out so well, and I'll bet you all of a sudden the child will be fine, as opposed
Yeah.
to otherwise. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I see your point. And also, I just want to make one point of clarification. I know it's early and we might not all have had our 5 cups of coffee or whatever it is for you. But I think you meant PPP, right? Not PPE.
I did. You're right.
We've been saying PPE a lot because of the protective equipment. So if you have PPP,
Right. That's what I meant.
yeah, you might want to consider just putting that person on full payroll as opposed to paying the 2/3, because I don't think there's a tax. I mean, I'm not a tax attorney, but I think that you don't qualify for the tax advantages of the
You don't.
FFCRA. Okay, so then there doesn't seem to be any advantage at all to utilizing the FFCRA component here. It might make sense for your business just to put her just on payroll.
Right. And then the other thing was, if I have someone who says that using childcare reason, but I give them the option of working any of 68 hours in a week, they can pick. You can tell me you can work 10 hours, 20 hours, I don't care, and I don't care when it is. And your wife is working from home 40 hours a week, and they still refuse. Is that unemployment fraud?
Well, I mean, it sounds like it could be. So I'm going to tell you what I think that you said, and then you can correct me if I'm wrong. So it sounds like what you're saying is you have offered employment, which is 68 hours for 2 weeks.
No, for
So
1 week to choose from. Any of those hours they
I
want.
see. Okay, so how many hours would they be working out of those 68?
They can pick. It can be 10, it could be 15, whatever they can do.
So they can pick their number of hours. How many hours would they typically work?
40.
Okay, so yes, in that case, they could qualify for unemployment compensation. If there's a significant reduction in employees' hours worked, they can qualify for unemployment compensation. There is
No,
a form.
what I'm trying to do is be flexible and give them less hours because they're saying they need to do childcare.
Yeah. Well, they could end up qualifying. That, I think it's what you're doing in terms of flexibility is perfectly within the law, and it sounds like a creative solution that you come up with, Donna. So I think that sounds good. But the problem there is because there's a significant reduction in their hours, they could end up qualifying for unemployment compensation, and the federal funds are tied to their ability to qualify under state law.
Okay.
Thank you for that, Don. I hope that got your questions answered. You did have 2 really good questions
No,
in a row there.
She said it didn't get her questions answered, though. What am I
Sorry,
missing?
I zoned out. I had 2 guys come in my office and were asking me about something.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I wanted to give other people a chance. No, but what it is I would like him to work 40 hours a week. He's saying he can't, and I'm saying I'll be flexible, and he's saying he can't. And
Okay.
Well, then why is he still able to collect unemployment?
Okay, all right, I gotcha. So you're saying that, that he can work up to 40 hours. He's the one who's choosing not to. And I can talk to you a little more offline, more specifically, but it sounds like what you may want to do is go through the process of having him provide the documentation that's required under the FFCRA anyway. So he would need to provide a representation that he is unable to find acceptable alternative childcare, and that he has an actual child, someone who is a child, and he's unable to find childcare. And I think there was a slide in the presentation, which you'll all receive a copy of, that has that documentation. So Donna, it may help you to require him to put this on paper and to actually affirm to you as the employer that he does not have childcare. Does that make sense and answer your question?
Mm-hmm.
And I have my email address in the presentation. I'd be glad to talk to you offline more specifically. I want to make sure your question's answered one way or the other.
Sure. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. All right. The next question was from Bev, and Bev, you can clarify. She had questions about temp screenings in office buildings, and I'm guessing what you meant was where multiple businesses are in the same physical structure and they have different rules, or go ahead and clarify that a bit.
No, correct. And it's when there's multiple tenants in a building, what is the ruling for that? Because you're not actually taking the employee's temperature. Just hearing a lot of it more on with regard to Philadelphia, but we do have office buildings locally. So I was just wondering.
It doesn't sound like that's a situation that the Department of Health's order speaks to directly. So just to clarify the question you have, and I can imagine this scenario in Philadelphia where you have multiple large employers in the same large building and you're trying to take employee temperatures. One part of the Department of Health's order or guidance that seems a bit dysfunctional to me, at least in the workplace, is that the Department of Health is saying that employers need to take temperatures on the premises if there is a probable or confirmed case. That isn't necessarily going to be too simple for large employers. That sounds like something that is going to need to be practically worked out by the maybe working with the landlord and the other employers involved to maintain social distancing and to take temperatures. We could need to have some level of compromise in taking temperatures off the premises. There is no particular teeth to the Department of Health's order. So in other words, the Department of Health does have the power to enforce certain fines and violations and stuff like that against employers, but it's not as though the Department of Health's order provides some way that employers will face any kind of significant fines or penalties. So if you as the employer need to work out some kind of creative way to take employees' temperatures based on the circumstances of the workplace, that sounds like something that would just be important to document the rationale and to make a business decision as to how you're going to manage the need to comply with the Department of Health's order and also the practical situation of the workplace.
Makes sense.
Question just going down. Looks like next question was from Denise, and you can clarify when I'm done here, Denise. But if an employee reports a company to the health department, can the employer find out the name of the employee? Additionally, how are health department claims validated?
Well, that's a really good question. So the Department of Health has provided a reporting procedure for employees to report any particular violation of the Department of Health's order. I have not heard of, and we work with many large businesses across this area. We have not heard of a single instance of a business actually being contacted by the Department of Health because of an employee complaint. There would probably be there isn't any way for an employer to know the specific name of an employee for any other type of report or violation. So I highly doubt that there would be a mechanism here, but I don't know because this is a very new procedure. It's doubtful. You may be able to figure out who it was through, just what happens when the claim is ultimately investigated by the Department of Health. But we would just want to be careful in those circumstances. The typical lawyer line there is just to be careful of retaliation against an employee for making a report to an agency. But that being said, I understand the concern there and wanting to make sure that the employees you're hiring to work for you are actually working for you and not trying to work against you. But yes, the Department of Health does have a reporting mechanism. It is unlikely that we would be able to tell which employee made that report.
Thank you. Denise, did you have more to add? Denise, you're muted, but if you had more,
Sorry about that. Yes, I do know of a company that this happened to, and it's assumed to be a vehicle by which employees can stay on unemployment then, because they expressed a concern to the health department, and this is all allegedly, but they filed a claim with the health department. The state police show up saying, that they're trying to shut it down, whatever, because of this claim. Now, I don't know what steps are taken. At this point, the company just contacted a lawyer, and it's, this literally just happened. So.
Right. Okay, well, that's great to know, Denise. Thank you for sharing that. I wasn't aware of any cases, so it's good to hear some news about what has happened. So I appreciate you sharing that. Yes, I absolutely could see that as a measure employees are taking to remain on unemployment compensation. I mean, this is for lower paid workers. This $600 weekly is a tremendous windfall, and people will fight to keep this going for sure. Undoubtedly. Um, claims of unemployment compensation can be contested, as many of you well know. Probably many people in this room right now have been involved in procedures to investigate unemployment compensation claims and to determine whether or not they're viable. So I would just encourage all of you as the employer out there to continue to report refusals of suitable work. Even if the employee tries to claim the work's not suitable, you know it is. I would encourage you to continue making those reports and continue to contest the claims. And that's really all we can do, unfortunately. But I appreciate the news as to the report. I'm sorry to hear that, but that.
Yeah. So it was the state police that actually informed the business that there was a health code violation.
Okay.
It wasn't anyone from the health department, which was
okay. Well, that's interesting to hear, and absolutely that could be an effort to stay on unemployment compensation. But as I said, all you as the employer can do is report accurately and honestly. You know that your workplace is suitable, even if an employee would be making those claims. Once you've investigated, if you do get some kind of a claim like that brought to your attention, the process that I would encourage you to follow is this. And if you're lucky enough or large enough to have an HR office, all the better. But you would want to have the complaint itself documented, and then you would want to conduct an investigation of the complaint, meaning interviewing employees or anyone relevant to the particular allegation that your workplace was unsafe. Then what you would want to do is document witness reports and any information that you receive from your investigation. Then what you would want to do is at the end come up with an investigation report that provides that either the allegation of a health violation was founded, unfounded, or unable to be determined, and then a fact-based explanation. It was wise of this company to contact legal counsel, especially if you're not large enough to have an HR department. For those of you out there, I know we have a few people in HR out there here today. HR is trained in fact-finding and investigations. If you are not large enough to have an HR department, you might want to procure some kind of outside counsel to help you investigate that claim, and then to make a documented report. Your report would be evidence for unemployment compensation, for workers' compensation, for any other type of purpose that may come up, that you as the employer did a complete investigation of this claim and it turned out to be, in most cases, unfounded. And then you'll be able to establish that you conducted actual interviews, you yourself went to the area that was a concern, and you fully investigated the perception or the issue that they thought they were raising. So in that case, my recommendation would be complete investigation, fact-finding, and documentation.
Thank you. Thanks for that. That's good info.
Thank you. Sweet. All right. Thanks, Lisa. The questions are popping in. We'll keep rolling here. Anna Maria has a two-part question from Eastern Engineered. Interesting question about maintaining these medical records when we do temperature checks, and are we allowed to do that? And then another question about sick pay. Anna Maria, if you could elaborate a little more on those two questions so Keely can answer them how you want.
Sure. And Keely, I think you addressed this in another call I was on with you, but I just want confirmation about our desire, maybe is the right word, versus requirement to keep some of these temperature check and questionnaire type questions, and whether we really should be doing that.
Right. Okay. So what type of, when you talk about documentation, are you, as an organization, thinking of creating documentation, or have you already created documentation?
We have FFCRA request documentation, but we're not in a situation where we're doing, a wellness check at this point. My question is should we need to do that? And knock on wood, we won't. What kind of medical record, if you will, maintenance is necessary or really even recommended?
Right. Okay. All right. A great question, Anna Maria. Thank you very much for the question. That's an extremely important question. And it seems to be the source of a lot of confusion and misinformation. So I appreciate you raising that. If you as the employer are doing regular wellness checks, you may want at the most to establish some kind of a checklist process so that you can make sure you got something back from every employee. What you really want to be careful about is maintaining records of employee temperatures. We received, although OSHA does not have any specific guidelines out dealing with COVID-19, Anna Maria, I believe you were in this same meeting with the OSHA investigator and representative who explained that the creation of a record of employee temperatures could be is actually a record of workplace relevant to workplace infections that needs to be retained for something like 20 years under
Exactly, 30.
under the OSHA guidelines. So I mean, that comes straight from an OSHA representative, the kind of guy who would come out to investigate a workplace. So it may not be advisable to be creating those records. So what I would like you as employers to do is a takeaway before you do on-premises temperature taking and especially recording the results, to think about, why are you doing this? Why are you doing the temperature taking? According to, I'm certainly not a doctor, but according to the medical community, temperature taking is not conclusive. You could have an employee with an elevated temperature who in no way has COVID-19. You could also have someone with COVID-19 who does not yet have an elevated temperature. So I would just encourage you to stop and think about why you're doing it. Now, if you do have a probable or confirmed case of COVID-19, absolutely, for those first 14 calendar days, which is really just, as you know, just 2 work weeks. That's not a significant amount of time. But just for your general day-to-day operations, why are you taking temperatures? Are there other ways that you could be evaluating whether you feel safe having an employee onto your workplace or not? What are the employee's symptoms? Does the employee have symptoms of COVID-19? That might be perhaps a more accurate measure of reporting. And what you could do is just every day have employees report in to confirm, that they do not have any symptoms. That doesn't need to be a big documented record. That would just be a daily wellness check. And you certainly could keep track, perhaps in the form of a checklist. Yes, John Smith reported in for the workday that he did not have any symptoms and his temperature is not elevated. Check. That is a lot different from creating a full-on medical record of what John Smith's temperature was and exactly how he was feeling that day. Those more specific records get into the territory of OSHA record maintenance, which is a heavy and significant obligation for you. And then they could also be considered, depending on the information that's maintained, an employee health record. Under the Americans with Disabilities Act, employee health records, whether the employee has a disability or not, are considered confidential medical records that need to be maintained in a separate confidential file that may only be accessed on an as-needed basis. So Anna Marie, that's a great question. I would just recommend, first of all, to first step, stop and think about why you're doing temperature checks. Why are you doing this? Are you just you should have a business-based reason for doing it, either that your workplace is more crowded, that your workplace might be more subject to infection, something of that nature. So why are you doing it?
Right.
Yeah. And second part, if there is an actual reason to be doing it, what type of documentation do you really need? So what type of documentation? So step 1, do I really need it? Step 2, what type of documentation am I really going to need to take out of this for my business reason? And step 3, then how am I going to maintain that documentation? So whenever you collect employee health records, I would just encourage you to take a step back and think, okay, I'm collecting this health information. How am I going to keep it then? How am I going to maintain it? And if there isn't a simple way to maintain that record, maybe you want to reconsider whether you're making it in the first place.
Right. Thank you. I was, like I said, I had heard that earlier and I thought that might be a good question for the group here. Thank you for confirming.
Yes, you're welcome. And thank you for the question.
I did have a second part question, not second part, a second question. Employee had already exercised FFCRA for self, so the 2 weeks out at 100%. did have a doctor's notice with regard to being an asthmatic person, continues to have situations where asthma is something that he brings forth to us with regard to PPE and different topics, always providing a doctor's notice, but the individual smokes. And I know, you know, one may not affect the other, but my question is should he get a notice that he needs to be out? That would be traditional FMLA, not expanded in this case, I would assess. I mean, he doesn't qualify obviously for childcare, so if he would need to be out, he would just be out normal FMLA, correct?
Yes, so that's another good question, and that goes back to the slide that I think somewhere near the middle of the presentation discussed, which is the three sort of steps or categories to place employees in who are resistant to returning to work in the COVID-19 era, that we now have to make more of an individualized determination than we're used to making, or at least it's advisable that we make a more individualized interpretation, because we don't, as the employer, you may want to manage your risk a little bit differently. So with this individual, he's somebody who's asthmatic. Was he having these problems before COVID-19, or is this kind of a new thing?
It was commentary, but it was never a reason to be out, other than forgetting his inhaler and needing to leave.
Okay, so I think I also heard you say in there that he was not comfortable wearing PPE or with the mask, probably because of his asthma.
Correct.
Is that part
of what rectified that with a shield?
Okay, and that good. Okay, because that was going to be part of my recommendation, that maybe you rectified another way. Okay, so walking through those three categories of employees. First category was the red, the stop sign. Is this an employee who absolutely must be out of work? It sounds like he has received his legally required leave entitlement under the special sick or the emergency sick leave for the first 80 hours or 2 weeks. It sounds like he's already received that. Is that right, Anna Marie?
That is correct.
Okay, so our next question is there another legal reason why he'd be entitled to leave? We would look to the FMLA, Family Medical Leave Act, which is applicable to employers with 50 or more employees. I know that you absolutely do have 50 or more employees. That would be my next recommendation, is to provide him with the FMLA paperwork to take to his doctor and complete. It doesn't sound, though, like he'd be eligible for FMLA, because it doesn't sound like he has a serious health condition as that's defined by law. It sounds like he just is having difficulty with the PPE. Is that correct? Or
correct? And I'm just this is kind of futuristic thinking right now. We're okay. I mean, the shield seems to have satisfied everything, but it's just an employee that you just monitor. We'll leave it at that.
Right, yes. So if he were to ask for leave in the future, I agree with your instincts, Anna Marie. That's a very good thought, to provide him with the FMLA paperwork. If he's not asking for actual leave and he's expressing difficulty with the PPE, in the Department of Health's order, it is actually addressed that employees who are unable to wear the face mask due to a disability or another condition should be given some type of accommodation to the extent that one is available. So what you would want to do, as you, Anna Marie, just explained that your organization did, which was very good, was you went through a reasonable accommodation process with him to determine whether there was anything else that you could do aside from leave that would bring him back to the workplace. And you did. You came up with the idea for a shield. That is a great idea, and that is in keeping with the idea under the Americans with Disabilities Act to look for an accommodation for that employee.
Sorry, I was on mute. Thank you.
That's all good. All right, we're after 9, so this is normally when we start to wrap these meetings up. We have a couple more questions, and this is, I honestly, this is where my best time would be spent right now, hearing the answers to these questions. So we're going to keep rolling. Stay on as long as you can, folks. At some point soon, we'll be wrapping up. Ken had the next question. Essential business has an employee who claims medical reasons for the reason to work from home. Repeat attempts to get a doctor note to no avail. Employee continues to demand to stay at home. What is the best path forward? Ken, feel free to elaborate on that.
Yes. So let me just make sure I understand the question, Rob. Can you run that question by me again?
Yeah, sure. Actually, Ken, if you're still available, can you just clarify that for her?
Yeah.
Essential business, essential employee. They never shut down, made modifications to allow her to work from home. Repeated requests to get doctor's note and proper documentation. Nothing's moving on that front. And she continues to demand working from home. Actually making it look more like she wants to make it a permanent situation, which just is not going to happen. So not sure how best to move that forward.
Yeah, well, that sounds like, is this an ADA situation? Has she claimed that there was some kind of medical reason?
No, it's actually, I mean, she mentioned bronchitis, which I'm not a doctor and I'm not an expert on all of this. I'm not sure whether that qualifies, but any request to get proper medical documentation has just fallen on deaf ears. So there's no way to substantiate it in my mind.
How many employees do you have, Ken?
In this instance, not my office, but 25.
Okay, all right. So your office would fall under the obligations of the Americans with Disabilities Act. What I would recommend that you do is you've already asked for medical documentation. I have an ADA accommodations packet that I work with my clients to put together. I don't know if your organization has anything like that, or if you can contact your legal counsel for some kind of a template like that. But I would encourage you to make one final effort in writing to have her provide information from her physician. And then if she is unable to do so, then you as the employer are unable to ascertain whether or not she is eligible for whether or not she is quote unquote disabled, as that term's defined by law, or whether there's even a reasonable accommodation that would allow her to perform her job. Based on what you're saying, it sounds like work from home is not a reasonable accommodation. It sounds like that's not reasonable for your workplace.
Correct.
Right. So then you have no legal obligation to provide employees with adjustments that are not reasonable for your workplace. And the factors that go into that analysis really are business-based factors, such as the cost of the accommodation and the actual workspace and resources of the employer. So the recommendation there would be to follow up with some type of final written request, whether it be you get some paperwork through your legal counsel, or if you have something there that you use, whatever works for you as the employer, just make one final request for documentation in writing. And if she's unable to provide you with some kind of documentation to verify that she is disabled as the law defines, and that she is and that there is a reasonable accommodation that would allow her to perform the functions of her job, then there are no legal protections in place. So if she doesn't qualify for leave under the FFCRA for childcare, and she is not disabled, and there is no reasonable, if she is disabled, there's no reasonable accommodation, then at that point, there's no legal protection for her employment.
Excellent. Thank you. I appreciate the clarity.
Sure.
Well, Dave Copew was wondering about maintaining. Dave, go ahead, explain your question. It'll be, again, probably easier for you to explain than for me to read it.
Hi, Keely. Great presentation.
Oh, thank you.
My question is, if I get in touch with somebody and they refuse to come back to work, yet we've maintained all of our furloughed employees' medical benefits, can we at that point either start charging them for the medical benefits or cut them off?
Yes.
Kind of as an employee to get them back.
Right. Absolutely. That sounds like a very good plan. And I'm sorry, what'd you say your first name was?
David.
Okay, I see Stacy there, and I thought that he doesn't look like a Stacy.
Yeah, I'm on my wife's computer.
Okay, all right. So, David, I would recommend that you do make some kind of a change there, because the situation's just too good for that employee. I mean, from their perspective,
Right.
employees who are not highly compensated, at this point, they're just doing so much better on unemployment compensation. So if they're receiving their full health benefits and they're receiving unemployment compensation, the situation's almost too good for them to pass up in a way. To get them back, you as the employer certainly could require them to pay the cost of health insurance. Now, you do have to, if they're on a group health plan, you can't just pull the rug out from under them.
It would be at the end of the month, of course.
Yeah, you'd have to offer some kind of so you're not talking about taking them off of benefits. You're just talking about having them pay that cost instead of you. Right.
Well, at the end of this month, we plan on bringing a bunch of people back.
Okay.
And we're sensing from a few of our employees the games that are starting to be played. And it's just something we're thinking of doing.
Yes, that certainly is one strategy that you could use. You're not legally entitled to pay that cost. You're actually, with the exception of the COBRA laws, which I'm sure many of you are aware of, you're not allowed,
Right.
You have no requirement to even continue their coverage while they're not working for you. So certainly what
Right.
you could do is tell them, starting after we start bringing employees back, there will be no more just employer paid benefits for those of you who are staying out.
Right.
That's actually
Right,
a really
thank you.
nice bit of leverage to have.
Yeah.
Another question from Eastern Engineered: entering the summer months, vacation season, should we and can we ask employees how they spent their time off? If they travel, can we require them to quarantine before returning to work?
Well, that's a good question. So this would be over the summer when you have employees who might be traveling. Yes, I see absolutely no reason why you can't do that. The legal protections for employee confidentiality mostly center around medical information. So if you are asking employees to quarantine after they return back from vacation, as long as that standard is applied to all, as long as all employees need to comply with that standard, I see no legal problem whatsoever with that.
Cool. Bruce with a question: if an employee does not want to return to work due to anxiety and fear and has been in counseling, is that handled differently than physical symptoms?
Well, that's a very interesting question. It practically now under the law, it's not handled differently from physical symptoms. I'll give you the legal answer and then I'll give you the practical answer. So first of all, the legal response is that it sounds like that employee could be eligible under the Americans with Disabilities Act for reasonable accommodations. If the employee actually has sought medical attention for anxiety, then the employer may need to go through a reasonable accommodations process, like I believe Anna Marie pointed out earlier with their employee, how they went through a reasonable accommodations process. So for mental health, employers do need to follow the same type of reasonable accommodations process as they would with an employee who has carpal tunnel syndrome or asthma or any other type of problem that would in some way impair their ability to function in the workplace. So that's the legal answer. The practical answer is yes, sometimes employees do get treated differently in those situations just because we all have anxiety about going back to work. There isn't anybody right now who doesn't have some kind of anxiety about going back to work for one reason or another. So it is possible that employees who are resisting coming back due to anxiety could at least have the appearance of not having any legal protection. That's why it's imperative right now to make the individual inquiries to the best extent that you're able to find out why the employee is resistant to coming back and what some of the history may be that would play into whether or not the employee has a legal protection. So yeah, that's a good question, Bruce. From a practical perspective, sometimes those employees are treated differently, but legally speaking, we should be making sure that we're offering accommodations and going through the process.
Okay, thanks.
Deal. Well, that I believe is the end of the questions, at least as I'm reading them, and looking at a couple different things here. I wasn't just saying that before, Keely. This was an impressive presentation. This was something that, again, topical, time-wise, there's a lot here, and I want to thank you for your time. You're very generous with your time, and everybody else who's on. I hope it was what you got out of it, what I got out of it, because this was a great one.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for having me here today.
Absolutely.
Can I make a comment?
You had mentioned, Keely, the PowerPoint presentation availability. I don't know if Bruce got that yet, or if that's something you can forward to us that we can share. Yeah,
Yes.
go ahead, Bruce.
I was just I wanted to do a couple of things. One is again to thank Keely for a great presentation. Great. And if you want to forward the PowerPoint to me, I'll make sure and get it out to the membership.
Will do. Will do.
And at some point when we all get back together face to face, we'd like to have you come and, if nothing else, just come and have breakfast and shake a few hands and chat with a few people. So.
Yes, I would be delighted to. It's been kind of a bizarre experience because I'm doing so many remote presentations, not to be able to actually see the people. So yes, I'd be delighted to come in and.
All right, well, I'll make sure and make that happen.
Good deal. All right, folks. Well, I think that's all we got for this morning. And remember, next Wednesday we got a meeting. Plan on spending some time with us that morning. I don't want to feel the rush to be done at 9 or 9:15. That's one that may take a while. Set the time aside. We're going to hear candidly from each other what we're doing and have some other information that'll be helpful for everybody. So set the time aside. We're looking forward to that. Thank you, everybody. Proud to be the president of this group right now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
You.
Have a good one.